In the chapter Speaking of Courage, the main character, Norman Bowker, has returned from Vietnam. He is struggling to assimilate back into normal society, and the chapter discusses his struggles of returning home. Norman is driving around a lake and recalling past events during his journey.
In the chapter Speaking of Courage, Tim O'Brien emphasizes Norman Bowker's medals. These medals are a motif throughout the chapter. Norman dwells on the one medal that he did not win and doesn't talk about the 7 that he won. O'Brien says he would have explained to his father that none of these decorations were for uncommon valor. These medals represent war for O'Brien. War consisted of a lot of devastating events. O'Brien wants to show how it is extremely hard for soldiers to return home after experiencing such terrible events. Norman's father says to Norman, "7, count 'em, you weren't a coward either," to which Norman replies, "Well, maybe not, but I had the chance and I blew it." The negative events hold so much weight in the heads and hearts of the veterans. In addition, the syntax of the conversations Norman has with his father are short and don't have a lot of intimate parts. This reflects what type of relationship Norman has with his father after the war. O'Brien also wants to show how he felt when he returned from war. In the chapter, O'Brien mentions that if his father had asked him about the medals that he won, he would tell him in detail all about them. O'Brien probably felt this way when he came home from war. He wanted to talk about his accomplishments, but was restricted because no one wanted to listen. In the chapter, Norman drives past some railroad workers. "Want to hear about the silver star I almost won?" Norman Bowker whispered, but none of the workmen looked up. O'Brien includes this to show how no one wanted to listen to him when he returned from the war. This is a perfect example of how Norman feels like he has no one to talk to.
One of the biggest problems that veterans can face when coming home is the feeling of being forgotten. Tim shows this in Speaking of Courage during the story of the A&W drive-in. Lines such as, "He felt invisible" and "He thought a question lingered in her fuzzy eyes" helps to prove the feeling veterans can feel when they get home. These lines directly show how Norman feels and how others react to him. However, Tim hints at the idea of being forgotten much more subtly. Throughout the chapter, Tim uses a lot of detail and imagery, but during the confrontation at the A&W stand, Tim switches to a very simple diction and he alters his pace to a more rapid pace. Tim establishes a conventional syntax throughout the chapter and then breaks that convention very abruptly. This creates a feeling of disunity or a separation from the rest of the text, similar to how Norman feels when he returns home. For example, Tim uses lines early in the chapter such as, "Now, in the late afternoon, it lay calm and soothed, a good audience for silence, a 7-mile circumference that could be traveled by slow car in about 25 minutes. Tim uses such long sentences early on, and soon the reader becomes to expect long sentences throughout the chapter. However, when we look at the A&W encounter, you start to see more and more shorter and less detailed sentences, such as, "He finished his root beer and pushed the intercom button." Shortly after this line, Tim includes a conversation between Norman and the man working the intercom. The overall message of this encounter is that people are willing to listen, but Norman won't talk. Norman is refusing to talk, which ends up being his hamartia. I included this line for 2 reasons. First, the detail is very limited and this creates a feeling of disunity that I mentioned before. Secondly, Tim is a master at having a sentence serve a dual purpose, and this line perfectly represents that. Tim is implying that Norman wants to talk with people, but he feels like he can't. He feels entrapped by his feelings, which Tim helps to show through the text meaning and the syntax. Tim uses both his writing and the meaning in the writing to show how veterans can feel forgotten when they come home from war.
One key thematic aspect that Tim O'Brien attempts to convey in the chapter Speaking of Courage is a sense of guilt that Norman Bowker feels over Kiowa's death, and in the larger scheme of things, the guilt and regret that most veterans experience today and during Vietnam when returning home from war. Many veterans returning home experience depression, anxiety, and other symptoms of PTSD. According to the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, about 30% of Vietnam veterans have had PTSD at some point in their lifetime. O'Brien shows the effects that war has on soldiers through the eyes of Norman Bowker. O'Brien primarily demonstrates this through his use of flashbacks and Norman Bowker's thoughts of Kiowa's death. These nightmare-like flashbacks are a motif throughout Speaking of Courage, occurring in the chapter about every 3 paragraphs or so. In the chapter, Norman's driving around a lake in his hometown, and while he drives, the haunting memories of Kiowa's death in the shit field in Vietnam keep recurring in his head in vivid detail. O'Brien uses a very descriptive, yet simple to understand, style of diction. For example, in one such flashback, Norman remembers how, quote, he crawled towards Kiowa screaming in the dark. He grabbed Kiowa by the boot and tried to pull him out, but he was gone. All he could do was watch. End quote. The diction used in this passage is evident throughout the rest of the chapter, where O'Brien includes a flashback to Vietnam. The tone of these flashbacks is depressed and scared. The syntax that O'Brien uses in the majority of these flashbacks are short to medium sentences. These short quotes from the passage of the chapter, along with the many other flashbacks that O'Brien incorporates into the chapter speaking of courage, clearly illustrate O'Brien's purpose of wanting to describe the guilt and regret that veterans feel over their actions in war once they return home. Norman can't help but feel like he should have done more to help Kiowa, and through these flashbacks, Norman gives the impression that he feels like Kiowa could be alive if he had been able to pull him out of the field. Norman shares these feelings with the many actual veterans that return home from war. After witnessing so much death, it is very easy for returning soldiers to have the thoughts of wishing they should have done more linger in their heads constantly. Although fictional, Speaking of Courage captures perfectly the long-term effects that war has on soldiers.
In the chapter Speaking of Courage, Tim O'Brien tries to explain through the character, Norman Bowker, how veterans, when they return home, feel like nobody is willing to listen and how they have no support in the transition between war and civilian life. This is shown by when the character Norman Bowker says in one short passage during the chapter, "The town could not talk and would not listen. How would you like to hear about the war?" he might have asked. The place could only blink and shrug. It had no memory, therefore no guilt. This passage shows how people treated veterans after returning from the war by using Norman Bowker as an example for this. During the passage, you see how O'Brien's syntax is very short and blunt, showing how Norman has been very quiet of late and makes it seem like he is stuck in his own thoughts. Also in the passage, you see that O'Brien uses personification to personify the town like it is a person who views down upon the veterans like many civilians did during this time and throughout all wars. Also, you see when Norman says, "How would you like to hear about the war?" that Norman, who represents all veterans, could be helped by just receiving the slightest sense of compassion of someone willing to listen to him speak his mind. I feel like O'Brien included that part because it shows how just telling stories is a way to help yourself recover after the war and mental drama. O'Brien talks about this in the chapter notes when he says, "I did not look on my work as therapy and still don't. Yet when I received Norman Bowker's letter, it occurred to me that the act of writing had led me through a swirl of memories that might otherwise have ended in a paralysis or worse." You can see from that statement that Tim O'Brien included the earlier story of Norman trying to tell people about the war as a way to cope with memories psychologically from it. When Tim talks about the real-life scenario mixed in with the fiction of Norman Bowker, it makes you realize that through his writing and the story, how much storytelling can help veterans when returning from war. Both of these moments help show what happened to someone who has the ability to help himself and the veterans that cannot get support from people or find a way to work through the memories themselves. These passages and lines Tim O'Brien used really help convey the main point of how veterans feel and are treated when they return home from all wars.